Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Federation Hall. I'm David Sequeira, and I am the director of the Fiona and Sydney Meyer Gallery, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. And before I introduce our guest speaker, Janelle Evans, I invite you to ground yourself in the deep knowledge that long before the VCA or the university was thought about, that the people of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri, the people of the Kulin Nation, practiced song and dance here for generations. They made paintings and sculptures, they shared stories, practiced healing, and that those traditions and rituals continue today. And please join me in acknowledging their elders past, present, and those to come. So our guest speaker today, Janelle Evans, it's a real joy to welcome Janelle. This is her first public presentation since being on staff with us. So Janelle Evans is Dharug. She's a multidisciplinary visual artist, curator and writer whose work is informed by her cultural and ancestral connections to country. In particular, her work seeks to question and disrupt the narrative of British and European first contact encounters, and to create a counter-discourse to resultant mythologies that are formed in the national consciousness. Janelle has exhibited in solo and group shows in galleries and biennales in Australia, Japan and France, and her works are held in public and private collections. Janelle has had artist in residencies at Bundanon, Tokyo Gedai and Turk Ra in Queensland's Moreton Bay. She's worked collaboratively with First Nations and other artists on several public and institutional art commissions for the State Library of Queensland, the Australian War Memorial, 4A Contemporary Asian Arts, and Campbelltown Arts Centre for the Sydney Festival. Janelle holds a bachelor's degree in visual arts, majoring in contemporary Australian Indigenous art practice from the Queensland College of Art, Griffith University, a first-class honours degree, as well as a Master of Fine Arts and PhD. Janelle was awarded the prestigious Charles Perkins Memorial Prize for her honours degree. In 2014, she was a recipient of the HS Carslaw Memorial Scholarship from Emmanuel College, the University of Cambridge, where she undertook her studies as part of her master's degree. Janelle was a finalist in the University of Sydney Graduate Medal for her master's thesis and exhibition, and this work was subsequently selected for New Contemporaries exhibition in Sydney. Janelle was a recipient of the Macquarie Bank Indigenous Scholarship for Professional Development at the Australian Film, Television, Radio School, Sydney, and Melbourne, where she studied film production, directing and scriptwriting. Her short films have been screened in cinemas and festivals both domestically and internationally, and we're really, really fortunate that Janelle lives and works here in Naarm, where she's senior lecturer in critical and theoretical studies, and she's also acting head of the Masters of Contemporary Arts program at the moment. Wherever you are, in Federation Hall or in Zoom land, please make Janelle very, very welcome.
Warami, hello in my Dharug language. Thank you, David, for that very warm, welcoming introduction. I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledgements to elders past, present and emerging of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations on the lands in which we are gathered today. And that brings me to the image that you see on the screen. This was from my first year undergraduate at Queensland College of the Arts. It's called Ngangara, and it's the gathering of bogong moths. Every year they travel from all down the eastern seaboard, from southeastern Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales, Canberra, and they meet in near Mount Bogong. And local clans from these areas would also meet around that area every year for festivals, ceremonies, gathering, feasting, trading, singing and dancing, which reminds me also that on the lands on which we gather, these practices have been continuing for more than 65,000 years. So different communities coming together, collaborating, that's essentially part of, a very big part of our cultural practice as well. Part of my practice is collaborative work. I have been collaborating with First Nations artists in my own local community, but also other communities that have also come together, and as well with non-First Nations artists. This particular work, if you go to the State Library of Queensland, you'll see it facing west towards Goma. It's a 3-story mural. The lead artist on this was the late Laurie Nielsen from the Proper Now Collective. And we worked with, well, there were seven or 8 other artists, including myself, working with Laurie and the Brisbane elders and community in Brisbane along the Brisbane River to find representation from each community and how that could be portrayed on this mural, which is made from red cedar and hebel. It's a close-up. So my work that I've done is in there. I can get a pointer, doesn't work. But some of the symbols from Dharug, you'll find the lozenge shape just on the right-hand side. That's my work there, as well as some others. So we're told that this work should last at least 100 years, which is a very comforting thing for us to know that we do actually have a presence now on Dharug, which is the place of the water rats on the Brisbane River. This work was undertaken during my residency at Tokyo Gedai, which is a fine arts university in Tokyo, working with 3rd year and postgraduate students at Tokyo, and a collection, but anyway, a group of 3rd year and postgraduate students from QCA, including myself, went to Tokyo. We had a transcultural exchange back and forwards about 3 or 4 times. And this was the first work we produced collaboratively, which was symbols of place from both Tokyo and Brisbane. And that was shown at the Taito Museum in Tokyo. And it was at Tokyo that I first started thinking about a peripatetic way of practice, which was walking through country and connecting with country, thinking about country. And so these ink drawings, I had lessons with some very well-known artists and teachers at Tokyo Gedai in calligraphic practice using Japanese ink. So these, among others, were the first kind of iterations of actually walking through country, thinking about poetry, reading poetry, or stories, and connecting with place. So they're quite lyrical and poetic in nature. And I'll show you how that shifts when I come back to Australia. So again, also in Tokyo. So these are rivers that I'm walking along. And then when I come back to Australia, the big shift happens. And I'm working in the same kind of methodology, walking through my country, thinking, deep listening, connecting with the history of country. And it's during this process that the weight of history in this country kind of hits me full force. And you can see how significant the change is. So the materials that I use, I sit and connect with country, I listen, and I'm in place. And I use the tools that I find, which could be sticks or twigs, leaves, feathers, whatever is around me. And these materials I don't take with me, I just work in place to make these calligraphic marks. So reflecting on this work, it took me a long time really to be able to actually feel comfortable about connecting with country and working with the landscape. Several years, in fact. And it wasn't until COVID, having that time during lockdown to actually reflect not only on my practice, but also on the shifting conversations that Australians, both First Nations Australians and non-First Nations Australians, are having about belonging and being in this country. That I was able to kind of work through some of this. So this was when we were allowed to travel 5 kilometres, you know, within a 5 kilometre radius. So I went to the beach using a pinhole camera, and here I am. I'm dancing with myself in the time of Rona, using the pinhole camera, which I'm sure you know is a lensless camera and relies on light to develop an image. And it doesn't record movement. So in this dancing with myself, I'm actually gesticulating quite wildly with my arm. So half of my arm has disappeared in this because the camera doesn't record it. And then it also has this kind of very poetic, dreamlike quality to it as well. And you see that more here, this kind of blurriness and indistinction. And I'm trying to think about in this, this beach as being a place, a contested space, where this is literally where the first fleet first landed, and in Warren, which is Sydney, and met by the local Dharug people. So I'm thinking here about being by myself in the time of COVID, and I'm also thinking about all of my ancestors or my ancestral clans who, as well as the Gadi people and the Dharug people who died as a result of smallpox that was introduced, where populations were decimated. And I really felt the weight of that as well. And I'm also responding here to the Scream and Francis Bacon's Pope Pius Scream as well. So that my head is exploding. So this work, this is just the raw data. I have never exhibited this yet, but I'm working it up into, or thinking about ways how I can present it in an exhibition. And it's becoming part of a wider project called I Am. So I am dancing in the time of Rona, but also I am still here. And we are still here. And I think that after the COVID epidemic and the lockdown, I think we all have personal stories about how that impacted on us, and that we are still all here. But it has wider significance for First Nations people, given the history of what's happened here. So after this performance on the beach, I was finally able to walk through country again, and finally able to start painting country again. So these are from Dharug country. The exhibition is called Dharug Mirum, which is I belong to Dharug country. The blue small paintings, Baramata, Parramatta is the name of the river. It's the place of eels. Parramattagal, clan name for the people who belong to the place of the eels. And it's a significant place for us, particularly for not only a food source, but also as a place of increase. And there are many songs and ceremonies associated with that. Burma, which is the land painting on the right, also it's hard to see in this photo, but it's a very kind of textural surface texture on the land of this painting. These two here, Dharug, on the left of the screen, I'll show you the close-ups. So yam, Dharug, which is the small little tooth that we have, and yams are little and they're shaped like little teeth, so that's why they're called Dharug. It's an important food source for us. So these are the seeds from Dharug. And then Badu is the other painting, Badu meaning water. And this is the place of the ponds where the eels end up spawning. So Badu here, water. So it reflects the ripples on the water, so it's topographical, but I'm also referencing surrealist style of painting, which is one-line continuous painting and allowing the unconsciousness to drive the expression rather than deliberately trying to replicate ripples in water. And here we have the sea painting. And then a different exhibition of the Parramatta, the stones, the river, and the reeds. So I mentioned earlier about the kind of contestations and history of what has happened to our people in this country. And I had a residency, well, 6 residencies actually, from 2008 to 2012 at Tiapurua in Queensland Moreton's Bay. It's an island just off the coast of Stradbroke Island in Jarraba, and it was a place for tens of thousands of years for gathering, for feasting. And the entire island is mostly made of shell midden. So you could probably dig down quite a number of meters and you would just find limestone and shell. But in I think it was the 1880s, 1890s, the Queensland government at that time introduced the Aboriginal Protectorate Law, coupled with the Opium Law. So the protection of Aboriginal people and Opium Law. Why those two were together, I don't know, but anyway, that's how we were seen. We weren't part of the Constitution, and we still are not part of the Constitution in this country. We weren't recognised as human beings. We were recognised as being part of the flora and fauna of this country. So on this particular island, Tiapurua, formerly known as Peel Island, it started as a quarantine station for ships that were coming into Moreton Bay from overseas, with bringing immigrants. And so they had diseases like cholera and typhoid, and they would be placed on the island, quarantined. If they recovered, they were allowed onto the mainland, and if not, if they died, they were buried on the island, or they were shipped back to their country of origin. And in a kind of, I don't mean the word parody, but to some extent, something like that, an island of incarceration of the mainland, which had also been a place of incarceration, is something quite ironic, I suppose. Anyway, by the 1910s, the Benevolent Society had taken over the island as a place of incarceration for inebriates. And then later, that was then transformed into a place for people who were usually wrongfully or wrongly diagnosed with leprosy. And these huts that you're seeing, these corrugated huts, they measure about 10 feet by 12 feet. So 3 meters by 4 meters, roughly. And they had dirt floors, and they housed between 10 to 20 First Nations people on this island who were rounded up. Some of them would have had diseases or illnesses that weren't leprosy, but they were diagnosed with leprosy. And they were forcibly removed to the island, and they were assigned a number. And for the rest of their life, they were known by that number. And I've done some work in the archives in Queensland to try and marry the number with the name of the person. And in the case of First Nations people, it's very difficult to correlate that. There were non-First Nations people on this island as well, but they had little houses that were constructed for them, and it was only one person per house. So they were also assigned numbers, but in the records, their actual names are recorded as well. They were not allowed to have family or friends visit, and they were never allowed to leave the island. So during the, and this is another version of it, it's a ruin now, although the Queensland Department of Environment is currently working to make this a tourist attraction. So during the 6 residencies I had, things that I noticed about the ruins here were that after the 1930s, all the First Nations people were again rounded up from the island, and then they were taken up to Phantom Island off the coast of Townsville and onto Palm Island. So people from southeast Queensland moved to North Queensland, disruption between families, so people not knowing who they are, where they belong anymore, and no records kept. So I wanted to interrupt this by a performance. So I lived in one of the huts for 4 days, and I slept on the floor, and I only used what was available to me, which would have been similar conditions. There was barbed wire around the compound. There was a running tap, but there was no place to wash apart from the tap. And the compound itself is like a panopticon. So there's a tower similar to our stables, I guess, where the superintendent could survey. So in this performance, I cover the face so that I cannot be surveyed. But the body also becomes a site for surveillance. So prior to the residency, for a number of years, these huts were also used to house pigs. So they still had all the waste products from pigs. So I was lying, and that wasn't very nice. It wasn't very comfortable. And I needed a good bath after that. And these were documented by a very good friend of mine, artist Dutchy Dang, who I've collaborated with on several projects. And I'm wearing a sheet, and I have a stick, the walking stick, which is important for us, but also I'm referencing, there's a passage in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in Isaiah, where it talks about people who are othered. Because they have leprosy, they have to be cast out, and nobody's allowed to talk to them or even look at them. And they have to be wrapped in a one sheet. So also on the island, in the ruins, there are, like in the former doctor's quarters and the mini hospital, there were a lot of medicine bottles and just paraphernalia and materials, archival materials dating from the 1880s through to the 1950s. And in amongst that, evidence of how the people who were interred on the island were used as guinea pigs for drug companies to trial vaccines for leprosy. So it also correlates with photography of that period and how Thomas Huxley, the cousin of Charles Darwin, created this kind of master plan of how to document tribal people, how to measure the skull, how to measure the body. So I'm measuring me here. This is me measuring me. And so again, this is raw data. And then I make the work, which is black and white prints onto these medicine bottles, taking fragments of my measured body and printing directly onto the bottles. And this work got stolen when it was exhibited. So I only have, this is the only image I have of it. So I'm going to need to refabricate it again at some point. So talking about fragments as well led me to my next project, which this is part of my master's. I'm only going to show you a small part of the master's project. It was quite big and it's still an ongoing project. Those of you who study photography will probably recognize the image of the woman. It's Georgia O'Keeffe, photograph taken by Stieglitz. And I'm responding to another island, which is Fraser Island, and now gone back to its original name of Kagari. And this is an island, another sand island on the coast of Queensland, where in 1836 a shipwreck occurred, the shipwreck of the Stirling Castle. And on board was Captain James Fraser and his wife Eliza. And she was one of the few survivors. Her accounts of her experiences, her first contact experience, created a narrative that continues to have repercussions today in how First Nations people are seen. She was called lots of names, but primarily when she went back to England, she became castigated as a kind of a monstrous female. So this is what I'm referencing here by taking an image from a screen, from the digital world, printing it out, ripping it up, blowing it up, rephotographing it, enlarging it, blowing it up again, and printing it, and then collaging it, along with another image by Helmut Newton. So I've mixed the two together to create this monstrous female. And I'm doing this in reference to Gothic narratives, because it's at the time that Eliza is telling her story about her shipwreck encounter with the Bachelor people of Kagari Island that we begin to see in terms of the Australian mythology that's created around this event. We start to see the Gothic, all the tropes of the Gothic narrative coming into play. So this is what I'm working with. So it's fragments, it's the monstrous female, the monster, it's othering. And I'm taking her story that she wrote, that she published, and I'm just writing it on the wall using different materials to write. And then I wash over it with black ink, and then I rewrite, wash over it, rewrite, etc. And then in the end, I just obliterate it so that it's just a swirl of almost nothingness. And so the exhibition, graduation exhibition, included drawings and paintings of the island itself, as well as fragments of letters that were written to newspapers, because one of the overriding tropes that Eliza introduces into how Aboriginal people are seen in this country is as cannibals. And this trope and the myths that surround it still continue today, to the extent that in 2001, Senator Pauline Hanson wrote a book called The Truth. And in that book, she wrote, why would you provide funding for or feel sympathy for people who eat their babies? And so this was a provocation for me to go back into the archives and look at this story. What was the origin story within these first contact encounters? And all the letters that, letters that are published in the newspapers, all the accounts that are written in books. So I'm playing with different materials here. This is whalebone, which was used in Scrimshaw. I've taken one letter and I've written into this. Letters that Eliza wrote to her family or her other family members wrote, and deliberately placed upside down so that it's a bit difficult to read. Again, petrified whalebone, and this is the words on here. The text here is taken from some of the other survivors, so the crew members, their accounts of Eliza and how they viewed her, which the language that's used comes back to misogyny, but also this idea of the monstrous female. And working with drawing and painting in the landscape, but also ripping apart fragments from the book that she published and incorporating that text, those textual fragments into the work as well. So I also did films and other things, so that's only just a small part of it. And then after that, I went back to the town that I grew up in, which Pauline Hanson also grew up in. And I wanted to photograph my memories of that place. And I was quite shocked to find the specific street and little town that I grew up in was surrounded by barbed wire mostly. 80% of the population there is First Nations, as it was when I was growing up there as well. It's about 5 miles outside of Ipswich. And there's a house here, which was the house next door to where I lived. And the family in there were also First Nations. And there were drive-by shootings, and one night my friend was killed. So I hadn't been to this place. We only lived there for about 10 years. I hadn't been there since I was 16. So going back, I took the photographs, and then I used, these are the actual film negatives from a Hasselblad, which I've then drawn into, scratched into, painted into. And when they've been shown, they're usually projected on buildings. A Brisbane City Council wanted to screen them a couple of years ago on the Story Bridge, and they said they're hauntingly beautiful. Do you want to know the stories? And when they do, they're like, okay, we're not going to show them. So again, houses and just me reacting to memory, history, and forgetting. So this particular land here is where a massacre took place. There was a notorious Scottish family who moved into that area called the Fraser family, Fraser boys they were called, and they went through indiscriminately poisoning waterholes, killing whoever they came across. And that land just doesn't grow anything. I think if anyone's interested in psychogeography, they may understand. But that's there's a darkness there, and it's palpable. and it's a very difficult place for First Nations peoples to live in. So again. And then 2016, the late Queen Elizabeth, for the first time, opened up the archives in Windsor Castle. So King George III's archives are housed at Windsor Castle. And this was the first time scholars were actually allowed to access the archives. And what emerged was that in 1768, King George III gave instructions to a young lieutenant in the Navy called James Cook for his proposed expedition to the South Seas. Primarily it was to chart the transit of the planet Venus, but these secret instructions were also to ask James Cook to locate Terra Australis Incognito, the great unknown Southland. And as we know, he did find the eastern seaboard of this continent. What he didn't do, though, when he planted the British flag in the soil, or when he killed Gadi warriors or stole shields or spears, was that he didn't follow the instructions that King George III had given him to have peaceful brotherly relations with any First Peoples he encountered and to establish a treaty. And then in 1788, when Arthur Phillip was appointed the new governor of New South Wales, the colony of New South Wales, King George III again gave instructions to Arthur Phillip, which were also secret instructions, to again form peaceful and brotherly relations with the First Peoples he encountered, and to, with their permission, with the permission of the natives, to form a treaty. And he didn't do that either. So this painting here is taking those words from King George III, and I'm writing the text on this black background, this black wall, overlaying the words, just words overlaid over words overlaid. And I'm not only referencing those instructions, I'm also referencing many petitions that elders like William Dharug from Corranderk and others throughout history since first contacting this country have petitioned governments and British Parliament for a treaty to be recognised as human beings, to be recognised as having a culture, to be recognised as being the custodians of this land that we're standing on. And those petitions have never been received, in part, never been accepted. So it just, and promises were made, lots of promises were made, and they've never been kept, not once. And when they have, they've been revoked, as witness John Howard's revocation of WIC in the 2000s to enable mining companies to go into land that was handed over, sovereign lands that were handed over to land councils. That's now revoked. So it just becomes a lot of white noise. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janelle. Thanks for your incredible generosity in taking us through all of those spaces. I'm just wondering if anyone has a question for Janelle.
Sorry to hit you all so hard with really very provocative work. But I think that's my practice. I go into those places that people haven't been willing to go or find it difficult. So my exhibition practice does suffer as a result, because when curators hear the stories. They don't necessarily want to put them in the galleries. But there are some brave gallerists and museum directors who are more than willing to do that. And I find that in Europe, my work is received better, and I have more exhibitions in Europe as a result, I think, of the inquiry and wanting to know more. Mm.
I mean, I was going to ask about, you know, the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow has a curator of discomfort.
Oh, okay.
And that person's entire job is to rethink the collection, work with students about the notion of discomfort. So discomfort is integrated into that museum's programs. And I was just wondering about I mean, I know it's your work, but the impact of this work and the impact of seeing it and the impact of making it. And I mean, it's a personal question about your well-being and how you manage, you know, this history with contemporary experience. And, you know, just if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So it's definitely a burden, and there's a weight that it's not only myself, like Fiona Foley works in the space as well, and there are other artists who do too. So there's a burden that we experience when we go into the archives and find the stories. It's very traumatic, and I don't work with a lot of that material because, one, if it's not specifically related to my community, I need to find ways to navigate with the elders whose community it is, and that can be very traumatizing for them. So I have to find a balance. So, for example, with the Eliza Fraser story, I took it from the perspective of what her mob, her British mob, was saying about her and what she was saying, rather than how or what Bachelor people would say, because Fiona works in that space with her own mob, with the Bachelor people. And what I'm hoping is at some point we can come together and have a symposium and exhibition of both of our works. But it is a burden not only to read the material, but also to process it, to think about it, and then to kind of navigate how you might respond to that. So it can take a long time. But one of the really comforting things I find is that when First Nations people do come to see my work, the reaction is just so positive. So, for example, the treaty work, almost lit a fire in Sydney when it was shown, because not many of us knew that there actually was supposed to be a treaty. So on the I could escape. So it's too late. On the there's a lectern in front of the mural or the wall painting, and on that I actually have the printed out text of the George III instructions. So you can read through that text and actually understand the language and read what the language is. And that's a real kind of eye-opener, I suppose, for many of us, that it was supposed to happen and it didn't twice. So we'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah. But for me, it was the being on country, being on my ancestral lands was very difficult, knowing that our lands were the first point of contact, and that many of our ancestors died of smallpox and other diseases, as well as being removed from families. So I recently just found out that I haven't been able to find my great-grandmother. There's no burial record for her. I don't know what happened to her. And it's only recently by going into the archives that I found the last communication that the government had with her, or the last government record I've been able to find. It was miles away from where I knew she had been living. And then that led someone from the Northern Territory to contact me, because I'm on a bush telegraph thing, right? Someone from the Northern Territory to contact me to say, oh, like my great-grandfather was from that same area. And then we were able to meet and exchange stories and find that actually she had thought that her family were Arante, and in fact, they're Dharug. So people were removed long distances from point of traditional origin and place to all over Australia. And that was a way of separating us from our community, from our families, but also separating us from language and cultural practice. So what's happening now is that this coming together of telling these stories, of being able to have access to the archives, traumatic as they are, is allowing us to work with scholars and with cultural knowledge holders to start to kind of piece these fragments together. So we're working on a big project on the Seven Sisters storyline for my country, and then how that connects to other countries as well. So yeah, so it's really important being able to have access to the archives, but it's traumatic. But then there's also being able to get through that, finding ways to get support and to come together as a community is actually affecting change.
Thanks.
Good.
Is there anyone else with a question? Well, we might leave it there, Janelle. Thank you again, and welcome to the VCA. I know we're in semester 2, but we don't often get a moment to, like a public moment, to welcome people. Welcome to the VCA. Thank you for your talk today, and just big love. And thanks to everybody here. I don't know what else to say. Thank you.